if I was to ask you how many prophecies, I've got a little blank there so you have to be following along in the notes. If I was to ask you how many prophecies or predictions from Old Testament times in the Bible, hundreds of years earlier, were fulfilled just in the birth, life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, how many might you say? Now, if you know this beyond a shadow of doubt, don't say anything. But this is a lot of time where you're allowed to talk during the sermon. So what do you think? How many?
5.
5? 5, okay. 40?
20.
20. I didn't hear that last one.
Somewhere between 1 and 1,000.
Well, that's the closest so far. Do you know, and I think this is one of the greatest reasons to believe the truth claims about Jesus, is the fact that there are more than 300 prophecies, predictions from Old Testament times, hundreds and hundreds of years before Christ was born, about the birth, life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, all of whom were fulfilled in and through the life of Christ. I think perhaps one of the most compelling arguments for accepting Jesus as the Messiah and King, and accepting the story of the birth of Jesus as laid out in the Bible as historical fact, rather than a nice, heartwarming, made-up story, is the fulfillment of numerous prophecies, specifically around Jesus' birth and early years. For example, one of those is actually found in Matthew chapter 1, and refers back to a prophecy made in Isaiah chapter 7 and verse 14, which says, "Behold, the virgin shall be with child and shall bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel," which translated means God with us. Of course, this is not only a prophecy given about 600 years before Jesus was born, but it's also a miracle, only possible by the supernatural power of God. And then in chapter 2 of Matthew, we find at least 4 more prophecies. There are actually a couple of more in there beyond that, but at least 4 more that come true around the birth and early life of Jesus. And for a few moments, I'd like us to take a look at some of those prophecies, those predictions, where they came from in the Old Testament, how they were fulfilled, and I believe be given one more reason why we can have the confidence that Jesus truly is the reason for the season. And the first one I want to look at is in Matthew chapter 2 and verse 6. This was actually a part of last week's message on the Magi, the wise men, and it basically quotes from the Old Testament book of Micah, chapter 5 and verse 2, where in Matthew it says, "But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler who will be the shepherd for my people Israel." Now this isn't exactly word for word from Micah 5:2, but here Micah clearly is talking about the Jewish Messiah, the special one that God was going to send to his people. And this prediction was made by Micah 700 years before Jesus' birth. It was a time where the Jewish people, the people of Israel, were not living real well in line with what God desired. So this was actually kind of a judgment, that they were going to be punished as a nation, as a people, but that one day God would send a special one directly from heaven. And oh, by the way, he's going to come from Bethlehem. And 700 years later, Jesus was born, you guessed it, in Bethlehem. Now, Bethlehem was David's hometown, so that kind of got it on the map, and that really kind of pointed to the fact that Jesus was not only going to be the Messiah, but also a king and direct descendant of King David, who'd been the greatest king in the history of ancient Israel. However, it was also very significant because Bethlehem was pretty much a one-horse dust bucket of a town. It was a small town. It was not prominent. It was not outside of the awareness that it was King David's hometown. Probably not where you would think that the Messiah, the Son of God, would be born. Certainly not where the people of Jesus today would have thought the Messiah. We say, well, gosh, it's in the prophecies. Well, it's been 400 years since the end of what we know of as the Old Testament, and there's been an extended time of them waiting and looking for God, and maybe not paying as close attention to some of those prophecies as what you might think. Another prophecy or prediction can be found in Matthew chapter 2, and this is part of what Kathy read this morning, verses 13 to 15. It says, when they had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. Get up, he said, take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him. So he got up, took the child and his mother during the night, and left for Egypt, where he stayed until the death of Herod. And so was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet, out of Egypt I called my son. Now the point here is that Mary and Joseph are going to take Jesus to Egypt to protect him from King Herod's attempt to kill Jesus. And then in Matthew chapter 2 and verse 19, God again speaks to Joseph in a dream. He tells them to come back to their homeland, to bring Jesus home, thus fulfilling the prophecy in Matthew's mind. Now what I think is intriguing is that many times these predictions, these prophecies from the Old Testament had kind of a double meaning. They had both a present meaning in the time in which they were written, and then they had a longer range prediction or meaning. So if we go back to Hosea chapter 11 and verse 1, that's where this prophecy of out of Egypt I called my son actually came from. And I want to read it to you. From Hosea 11:1. It says, when Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. Now this prophecy has sort of a double meaning because it was originally referring to something that wasn't even a future prediction. It was talking about when God had brought their people out of Egypt. Remember, they were enslaved in Egypt, and you remember the plagues, and God sent Moses, and they bring the people, the ancestors of the people of ancient Israel out of Egypt, and the whole Red Sea, and the wandering in the desert. Well, that was understood as kind of the first referencing back to that moment. But according to the words that God gave Matthew here in chapter 2, this was also a prophecy, a prediction of Jesus coming back to his homeland after he had been sent to Egypt until after King Herod dies to keep Jesus safe, to keep him from being killed. Now this is interesting because there are other places that would have been much closer to home that could have been equally safe and safe havens. Understand that Mary and Joseph were going to have to travel 75 miles in that time, basically walking or riding on a mule, just to get to the border of Egypt, and another 100 miles to get where very many people live. So a 175-mile journey with a very young child. That was a huge endeavor at that time. But God says, I want you to go all the way to Egypt instead of hiding out in a territory a little closer to home, which would have been more logical and seemed to make more sense. Why? Well, for one reason, God knows the prophecy, and he's going to make sure that it gets fulfilled in order to point to Jesus as his son. But also, if you're God, and I'm glad you're not, and you're glad I'm not, but if you're God, you want to do something, and you want to make sure that people understand that it came from you and want to prove, show you some of your power in the midst of that. You don't say, go up to the road a little ways and hide down in the next town down. You send them somewhere far away under your cares. I think that the reason that God chose Egypt was not only because it fulfilled this prophecy, but to show that it was God that was working in and through this activity and event. Because only God could have gotten them, provided the means, and gotten them safely this huge distance, and then let them know when it was time to return. God chose Egypt because it was God that was guiding and directing that process. Another prophecy from Matthew chapter 2 can be found in verses 16 through 18. And this is one that, is heavier on our hearts. It's that one about all those 2-year-old little boys and younger that Herod takes out to try to take out Jesus. Verses 16 to 18 of what Kathy read, and I think I'm reading from the NIV, so it may vary a little bit from the Pew Bible. But it says, when Herod realized that he had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious, and he gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had learned from the Magi. So he's trying to figure out how old Jesus would have been and then giving himself some leeway. Of boys, and then what was said through the prophet Jeremiah, so now we know where it comes from in the Old Testament, was fulfilled. A voice is heard in Ramah, weeping and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children, and refusing to be comforted because they are no more. So weeping in Ramah. Now Ramah was an ancient town, which means that at the time of Jesus it was no longer in existence. It was an ancient town, Old Testament times, just to the north of Jerusalem. Bethlehem is just to the south, but again in the same general vicinity. Verse 18 is almost word for word back from Jeremiah, where the prophecy came from. You could spend a long time talking about all the symbolism, but I'm simply going to share that, again, this is one of those double fulfillments. It has two meanings when the prophecy was given. First, it was understood by the Jewish people to be talking about when they would fall as a nation, weeping in Ramah, Bethlehem, Ramah, Jerusalem, that area. Weeping when their enemies overcame them as a nation. But here, however, Matthew, under the guidance of the Spirit of God, sees this as a prophecy of this horrible cleansing of little baby boys. This incredibly brutal length to which Herod goes to try and kill Jesus and protect against any threats to Herod being king. You may remember, if you were with us last week, I looked at verse 3 in chapter 2. What we saw was that when the Magi, when the wise men came into town and came to Herod looking for the baby, the new king of the Jews as they understood him to be, that it said that not only was King Herod upset, but all of Jerusalem was upset. When we see what Herod did, the length to which he went to try to take out the baby Jesus, to take out Jesus as a young boy, we know why the city was upset. Because when Herod got upset, when Herod felt threatened, bad things happened. Now, unlike when God orchestrated the events to have Jesus go to Egypt to fulfill this earlier prophecy, this horrible event, as far as I'm concerned, as I understand the Bible, was not orchestrated by God. Herod orchestrated this act in defiance of God. And I would say sometimes this represents the challenging side of God giving human beings enough freedom, to give them freedom to choose the course and destiny of their lives and to impact our world. So that sometimes human beings make bad choices and they choose to do things that God would not desire. And yet, in an ironic way, I would suggest that Herod's fear of Jesus in itself supported the claim that Jesus was indeed the Messiah and King. Think of it this way. If Herod did not feel that Jesus had a right to the throne, somebody claiming this little kid is going to be a king, yeah, right. If he didn't feel truly threatened, why would he have even given Jesus the time of day, much less gone to this length to send out a decree to kill all the boys, baby boys under 2 years of age? Well, I would suggest that he saw, remember he called the religious teachers of his day and said, what is this star? What is this prediction of this birth of this Messiah? When the Magi came into town, he wanted to know more. And so he got all these prophecies, and they pulled out their ancient prophecies about the coming of Jesus. He met the Magi, remember the king makers. Historically, the Magi had approved of kings. He knew that the Jewish people were looking for the Messiah. You put all of that together, and Herod probably was thinking, oh my goodness, there must be truth to this. I gotta stop this. One more proof that Jesus indeed was the Messiah and King. And then a fourth prophecy in Matthew chapter 2 is found in verses 22 and 23. But it says, but when he, referring to Joseph, heard that Archelaus was reigning in Judea in place of his father Herod. So Herod had died, but now his son had taken responsibility. Joseph withdrew, having been warned in a dream, because he was afraid to go there. God told him in a dream, I want you to go to the region of Galilee. And he settled in a town called Nazareth. So was fulfilled, Matthew says, what was said through the prophets, that he would be called a Nazarene. Now this one's really interesting. There is no prophecy in the Old Testament that said Jesus would be called a Nazarene. So what's going on? How could it be? Well, one is that a couple of possible explanations. One is that there were many of their teachings and traditions that had been handed down through the centuries that had never actually been written down. And I would suggest John chapter 21 and verse 25 tells us that Jesus did many other things as well. In other words, in addition to all the miraculous accounts from the life of Jesus that we see written down in the Bible, John 21:25 says, oh, by the way, there's a whole lot more. If every one of them were written down, John says, I suppose that even the whole world would not have room for the books that would be written. So perhaps there were Old Testament prophecies handed down verbally that had never been written down, and maybe Matthew 2:23 is one of those prophecies that the people of Jesus' day knew came from God through the Old Testament, but were not actually recorded there. Matthew doesn't even try to defend. He doesn't try to make a case as to why this is the case. This is true. It's almost like the people already know it. But there's another possibility. Another possibility is that the term Nazarene was actually symbolic to mean something else. You see, people living in Nazareth, and even Galilee as a whole, the region that Nazareth was a part of, were not liked very much by those living outside of that area. They were even looked down on and despised by many of their own people that came from other areas outside of Galilee. So maybe, reminds me of, now is there a little, now we're far enough away. So I live down where Ohio, Kentucky, and West Virginia came together. And the Ohioans would talk about the Kentuckians. And the Kentuckians would talk about the West Virginians. And I'm not sure who the West Virginians would talk about. And the same thing existed when I lived up near Toledo, Ohio, Michigan, Indiana. The same thing happened. Ohioans would talk about the Michigan drivers. The Michigan would talk about Indian. And in their culture, this region was looked down on and made fun of and harassed. And yet this is the area where Jesus settled. There is a prophecy from the book of Isaiah in the Old Testament, chapter 53 and verse 3, referring to the future Messiah. It says, he was despised and rejected by humankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain, like one from whom people hide their faces. He was despised, and we held him in low esteem, which is the way that many of the Jewish people would have viewed even some of their sisters and brothers, in the Jewish sisters and brothers who came from the region of Nazareth and Galilee. So maybe when Matthew says that he would be called a Nazarene, what he's saying is he's going to be viewed by many, certainly including the religious leadership of his day, the way many of our people view those who come from Nazareth, which would then be a fulfillment of Isaiah 53:3. So I would contend that there are at least 4 prophecies fulfilled in Matthew chapter 2 alone. And if you try to say, well, this one could be a coincidence, or I can write off that one, or, this one over here could be explained away. It's harder to say that about all of them collectively. And it's virtually impossible to say that all the more than 300, I think there were 340 or 350 fulfilled predictions written hundreds and hundreds of years earlier around the birth, life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, that they were coincidences. In fact, they were not coincidences. They were the evidence, the God's proof, if you will, that the baby born in Bethlehem just over 2,000 years ago was the Messiah, and is in fact the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, ruler over all creation. The one and only one who can bring us into relationship with God through the forgiveness of sin now and forever. And the one to whom we need to bow down and to yield our lives today and every day. So go and tell to everyone that you know that Jesus is alive. He was born a humble birth in the little dusty town of Bethlehem, lived an incredible life filled with supernatural events, freely gave up his life for you and for me, yet was raised from the dead by the power of God and lives forever. And all those who call upon the name of the Lord, to be saved. Saved from the punishment we deserve for our sins. Saved to live life evermore with God. Saved from mediocrity in this world, but to count in powerful ways that will last forever. And one day, to live in heaven, in the very presence of God, the one who made it all possible. So go and tell everyone that Jesus Christ is born. He has come, and one day he will come again. Go in this Christmas season and tell of the miraculous birth of the Christ child and what he means in our world and what he means